So we are going to do the next one, which is actually not in the root text, the natural liberation text. He refers to it in some ways, but he doesn't treat it as a separate practice per se. But we've included one here so that we get the complete set, because that's the more traditional way of doing this, with the 4 thoughts that turn the mind rather than just with 3. And so this last one is on karma and reincarnation. And so a lot of people believe in the law of karma, and this has a modern parlance. We say what goes around comes around, for example, is a way we often refer to something along this same line. But it really refers to something a little more complex than that, the chain of events that happens of cause and effect that results in certain things. So you have causes, multiple causes potentially, and certain effects that manifest out of those causes. And according to karma, the literal word karma means action. And so what it's talking about is when we do something, the action, then that sets up a potential reoccurrence or implication for us in the future. I actually like to think about it as the process we go through of creating habits. Because if you just do something once, it typically does not become a habit. But it also makes it easier to do that same thing again. So if you tell a lie once, it's usually kind of difficult the first time we do something like that, but it's easier to do it a second time. And if we do it multiple times, pretty soon it becomes habitual, and it's just a natural way of doing things sometimes at that point. And so karma works very much like that. Now it's thought of in a little bit different way. We think of karma as a seed that's implanted in this continuum of thought, however we visualize that. And so these seeds get planted. If you lie once, the seed for lying gets planted. But it's just going to be a teeny little seed if you only lie once. If you lie a second time, another seed, or the seed grows. Okay? It becomes stronger and stronger when you do these same things over and over and over again. And as a result of that, it's more likely to come back in some way. Either in this lifetime, or from a Buddhist perspective, either this lifetime or a future lifetime, it will ripen, much as we think of seeds from an agricultural point of view. If you plant a seed, add water, soil, and so forth, then the seed will ripen, it will grow. And so under the right conditions, the right circumstances in our life, those seeds can, in effect, grow, manifest in our life.
Just one thing. Previously, somehow, somewhere, I learned that karma was also, if you do something to somebody, that, in other words, it comes back to the opposite. In other words, it's not just that you're going to continue to kill people, it's that you'll be then killed.
Yeah, that's another element to it. Yeah. Because karma also then affects our future lives. And so as we are born again, whatever the storehouse of karma in our consciousness, then indicates what is likely to happen in terms of our rebirth. Now before we were talking about it in terms of impermanence and the cycle of rebirth, that what we do actually has an effect. And so the action, what we do, whether we do it to somebody else or we just do it, those actions then plant the seeds. Those seeds affect that rebirth. And so one of the effects, potential effects, is that if we tend to lie in this lifetime, we'll be reborn with a tendency to lie in the next lifetime. If we have killed someone, for example, then we may be killed in the next lifetime.
Or if it's lying, in the next lifetime, we may have people who's lying to us.
Also, people may, right.
That isn't just a habitual of you're going to do the same thing. It's maybe what goes around comes around.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it's both. So that's the basic nature of what we're talking about here. It affects this life and future lives. And so it can go on and on and on. there are two ways of dealing with those. One is that we want to avoid these non-virtuous kinds of behaviors that result in that kind of action, that kind of a result. Another is that we can take a positive action to deal with the karma in a way that is through things like purification. When we get into the second part of the ngondro, we will do a Vajrasattva purification practice. That's one of a number of practices that can be done to purify our negative karma. And actually there's a third way, and that is that when in fact one of those seeds bumps into its right condition and manifests, it's burned up. It's no longer there. And so there's also that element out there in terms of a way of dealing with karma. Not, I think, the preferred method, at least for bad karma, but it is another way of dealing with that karma. And there are lamas out there who will talk about, well, when this negative karma comes up, you just let it happen, you're just burning it off. My preferred method is purifying it so that you don't have it, so that the bad circumstances don't manifest at all. Okay? And so there are methods that we can go about doing that kind of thing. But here we're thinking about it in terms of the fact that how we go about doing our lives, living our lives in terms of good behaviors, bad behaviors, and virtuous or non-virtuous behaviors have outcomes. They have consequences that affect our reincarnation. Okay? So that's the main focus here. What we're trying to do with that and the consequences with those kinds of conditions. Now, one of the things as we look at this, I mentioned that it was complex. And one of the things that has been taught and as a part of this is that it's very difficult for us to know, in fact, what our karma is and what the effects of that karma are going to be. And they recommend not trying to second guess it. They say the only ones that can really know are an enlightened, fully enlightened Buddha. Okay? So don't try to guess what it is. Part of the problem, from a philosophical point of view with this idea and other ethical positions, if you will, is what about dealing with things when good things happen to bad people or bad things happen to good people? Okay? From an ethical perspective, it's difficult to address because typically from that perspective, including a Buddhist perspective, when we talk about doing something good, we expect good things to happen. When we do things bad, we expect bad things to happen. But reality is that that's just not the way things always are. Well, karma becomes one way of explaining that, to say, well, must have done something bad in a previous life, and that's manifesting now in this life. Or must have done something good in a past life, even though the person's an SOB now, because good things are happening. You know, this bad person just won the lottery. Whatever it happens to be. So there are those difficulties from an ethical point of view in trying to understand and explain these things. Buddhism explains them, if you will, from that point of view of this law of karma, that the seeds are there and they can manifest in ways that don't look like they're appropriate for this lifetime, but in fact may be. So there's that aspect to it. Some other traditions, they may look at it from the perspective of God, wherever they visualize God and consider it, well, that's just part of God's plan. You sometimes hear that as they're trying to explain why bad things happen to good people or good things happen to bad people. They don't really have a logical explanation either. It's just a way of trying to explain or even rationalize what this is and what's going on. If we look at things from a scientific perspective, another point of view that we might take into consideration, we know that in fact there are patterns of behavior that do tend to affect us and affect others. Things that we fall into this pattern, and if we lie, we tend to lie more and so forth. And so those patterns in fact do exist, but we also know that there's a certain randomness to patterns. They don't always follow a perfectly logical linear pattern. They sometimes get a little messed up. For example, if you look at clouds, you go outside and you look at a cloud, that cloud may not look like another cloud. but you can identify that they're both clouds, right? There are some patterns about them that allow us to recognize them as clouds. We can even recognize certain types of clouds. There are cumulus clouds, or there's cirrus clouds, and there are, forgetting my names here, the different names of cloud patterns, and we can recognize those even though they're not identical. A little bit of a randomness to them. And we find that a lot in science. Well, the Dalai Lama has accepted that that randomness, in fact, can be a part of karma. When we talk about karma, we also talk about conditions, which I mentioned. Causes and conditions. So you have to have the cause that meets up with the right condition, the two of those coming together for it to manifest. Now there is, and have been, some teachings within Buddhism that talk about group karma. That, for example, when 9/11 happened, there was some discussion by some lamas about the group karma of the people that were in the Twin Towers that got hit at that time, or about New York City, or about the United States, and so forth. There was also a major earthquake in Tibet not too long ago that killed a few thousand Tibetans. And there was some discussion at that time that went on also about group karma as a part of that. The Dalai Lama, however, has talked about that and said that's not correct. He said that these people did not have group karma. He said there are certain random acts of random conditions that happen in nature that are not related to karma. So that would tie in more with the scientific perspective that yes, there are causes and conditions, but the conditions may in fact be random acts that just happen. And we suffer the consequences of those random acts in addition to the karma. So it can be even more complex than what we've tried to explain by some of the teachings from a Buddhist perspective. So that's something else just for you to consider, and as you hear different lamas talk about it from different perspectives, recognize that there are different viewpoints about this. It's not just this is the way that it is, even though some present it that way.
At one point, somebody was talking about the Chinese invasion of Tibet, and in those terms,
right.
It was the karma.
Right.
I've heard that
right.
It was the karma of what they had done, what the people had done.
That's been said about the Holocaust.
What? You can say about that, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. Right. Particularly in terms of that the only chosen people.
Mm-hmm. So there are things out there. There are different points of view about that related to karma. So my point is just to make you aware of the fact that there are these different points of view within the Buddhist tradition. Okay? It's not just one particular way of understanding it. And because of the complexities involved, it's very difficult to actually understand the chain of events from cause to effect, and so forth that come together to actually create that. So I wanted to point that out, and so that you understand that karma is part of cause and effect, and part of the nature of change. And so those things are linked, and they work together. So change is how we experience what is impermanent and the interdependent nature of material reality. So that change happens. It's impermanent. Okay? So that's a key part of it. So impermanence and karma are both linked together in very complex ways. So that's important to be aware of, as well as noting the various patterns of change that we see in different ways. So patterns of birth and growth and maturing, aging, dying, and so forth that we talked about a little bit in the last one. Those forms of change and impermanence also are a part of the karma and the cycling of birth and death. So we can then extend that to the idea of reincarnation as we go from one to another. But the pattern also is somewhat cyclical, but it's not necessarily a really fixed patterns. So we have to be aware of those, the causes and effects that are involved, and the consequences. But our behavior, our actions, particularly when they become habitual actions, are very important. Those tend to come back to bite us in this lifetime a lot. Okay? In addition to potentially future lifetimes. So very important to be aware of that, to think about virtuous and non-virtuous kinds of behavior. So in each of these parts of the class, when we've gone back and we've looked at the three teachings, the first one is ethics. And so that ethical point of view is important for us to be aware of in terms of how we live our life and how that then may affect us in other ways here. But remember that our primary purpose here is we're looking at these things in terms of the four thoughts that turn the mind related to our motivation. Okay? So here, when we're talking about karma and reincarnation, we're talking about it as a way of reflecting on it in order to motivate ourselves to do the practice, to follow virtuous kinds of behavior, and so forth. So that's the point here. There are other ramifications, of course, than that, but that's the main point of it in this particular context. And so we have a practice here, very short one, but because there's not one that's elaborated in the book, but will give us a way of doing this as a practice. And again, there is a handout for the online version of the class as well. As before, we begin by setting our intention and then take refuge. Take some time to sit in stillness. And then for speech, we say, all actions have consequences. I will take care with all my thoughts, words, and deeds. And other things, everything that we think, say, and do. Okay? And then with our mind, we contemplate our previous actions and known consequences. So we can think about, well, I did this and this was the consequence. We can think about specific things like that that have happened in our lives. And then think about other potential consequences of non-virtuous thoughts, words, or deeds. So maybe there are things that we have done where we haven't really seen a specific consequence from that, but think about, well, okay, I did such and such. I lied to a friend of mine, or I did something, I took something that was not given to me. I took that piece of pie when I wasn't supposed to do that, or whatever it might have been, and think about, well, what are the consequences of that? I think about times in the past when maybe I killed a fly or something. I used to do it without even thinking about it. Now, I simply would not do that, I would let the fly, if it was in the house, I would leave the fly alone, or if it was an other kind of insect that I could capture in some way without harming, I would capture it and take it outside and set it free, that kind of thing. So, thinking about those things and what the potential consequences might be of actions that we've done in the past is a part of this as well. And then we vow to only engage in virtuous actions. So we've promised ourselves that we're only going to do virtuous actions. We're no longer going to do those non-virtuous kinds of actions. And so then meditate continuously on this. So the first of the practices we do for the first half of the week, 3-4 days. And then we do this for the other 3 or 4 days. And we go back, but not just while we're sitting on the cushion. The rest of the day and night too, we reflect on, okay, what am I doing? What am I thinking, saying, doing? And what are the potential ramifications of those? So we think about it as much as we can over that period of 3 or 4 days. And then we always dedicate the merit as well. So here we dedicate the merit again for 3 times. So that is our second practice that we will do for this week.